Hey guys, in this video I want to go over this Reddit post right here, which is going over the game asset workflow for hard surface models in Blender. There's a lot of misinformation here, there's a lot of things this guy has wrong, and I just kind of want to answer everything here in this video. It's going to be super valuable, so keep watching. So this guy says, "Hey everyone, I'm honestly getting frustrated and could really use some insight from professionals or anyone who's worked in a AAA or realistic weapon pipeline. I've been modeling weapons for games and trying to push my quality to AAA standards, so clean shading, proper topology, realistic details, everything. But every artist I watch seems to use a completely different workflow, and I'm losing my mind trying to understand which process is the actual industry standard." Alright, so first of all, a quick note on industry standard. I don't like this term because the modeling workflows are contextual. If I'm modeling an asset that's going to be static, it's not going to be deformed, and it's just sitting in the scene, I don't care about the topology. I care about the design and the quality of the model and optimizing it properly, even if I'm using n-gons. Now, if it needs to be deformed or something like that, then I would take a completely different approach because I would need quad topology, clean topology per se, and I would essentially need to make sure that mesh is optimized for that reason. So when you say industry standard, it doesn't really mean anything. That's the way I see it, because the modeling workflows, especially for game assets, are completely contextual and based on what you're trying to accomplish. Now, I'll give you a quick story here. About 2 years ago, we briefly worked with a game studio, and they came to us because they wanted some props developed for their video game. And they specifically told us, they said, "We are not deforming these assets. We just need clean, well-designed, hard surface models that will sit in the scene." So we didn't worry at all about the topology. We cared about the design, we cared about optimizing it and making sure it worked in the actual game engine. All of these assets had n-gons, and it did not cause any sort of issues with unwrapping, with baking, with texturing. All these things that people think, there were no issues because we did the workflow based on that request. They didn't need it to be deformed, so we specifically focused on the actual model and less on the topology. Now, this guy also mentioned that he was worried about clean shading. If you go to a game like Star Citizen, these guys are doing a similar workflow to what I'm going to show you here. What they're doing is they're focused specifically on the model. They're not worried so much about the shading. As a matter of fact, if you go look at their models up close, a lot of them have shading errors, and I'll put a video clip on the screen here. These guys aren't worried as much about the shading as they are about the quality of their design. That is the approach you should be taking. You don't need to stress about perfect 100% clean shading. The only way you're going to get that, especially if you're using booleans, is through perfect clean topology or transferring the normals. And this guy said, "Here's where I'm stuck. So some artists use triangles freely in their low poly. Others say to never use them until export." I'm not too sure what he means by that. I'm going to show you the way I would approach this in a second. Then he says, "Whenever I use triangles, I get weird shading issues or smoothing artifacts, even after trying weighted normals or remesh." Now, this is where a lot of people go wrong. They throw shit at the wall and they think it's going to solve their problem. They think clicking on weighted normals will solve their shading problems. They think, for example, remeshing will solve their shading problems. They think pressing a button or just clicking something with no context or understanding of how it works will solve the problem. You need a fundamental understanding of why certain issues occur so you know how to fix them. You can't click a button not understanding what that button even does, like a weighted normals for example, and expect it to solve everything. So I'm going to go here into Blender and show you exactly why shading issues occur and how to fix them. So let me give you a rundown here. I'm going to add in a plane, okay? And on this plane, what I'm going to do is go into the matcap view and go into one of these, for example. And I'm just going to take one of these vertices here and just move that vertex up just a little bit. When I do that, we get a shading error. Now let me do this again with an n-gon, all right? I'm going to go to this one. I'm going to subdivide it, which creates an n-gon. I'm going to move some of these around. When I do that, we have shading errors. Maybe I need to use a different one to really illustrate that. But you can see pretty clearly that we have a shading error. It'll pop even better with cavity turned on. But you can see, just depending on how this is bent, you're going to get different shading errors on the actual mesh. Now, here's the interesting part. If I add in a triangle is obviously 3 vertices. I cannot physically bend a triangle. A triangle is always going to be flat. So no matter which direction or which way I move this triangle is always going to be a flat surface and is always going to have perfectly clean shading. Whereas with n-gons or quads, they're not going to be flat if I move one of these vertices here. But if these were combined together into a triangle, it's always going to be a flat surface. So I hope that kind of makes sense. So this is kind of the first fundamental misunderstanding that this guy has. He said, whenever I use triangles, I get weird shading issues. It's not the triangles causing the shading issues. Triangles don't bend. They're never going to have a shading problem. What is going to happen is you're going to use booleans, especially on a curved surface, and that is going to cause exactly what we see here, shading distortions. Now let me show you an example with a boolean, okay? Let's say I have a cylinder, and I'll rotate the cylinder, I'll scale it a bit, I'll shade it auto smooth, and then I go in here and then I run a boolean, just like this. The moment I do that, we get shading errors. And the reason for that has nothing else to do other than the fact that we have a bent polygon right here. This boolean creates this n-gon right here, which is bent. It is not flat. So for example, if I duplicate this and move it out, you can see that's bent, and that's why you have the shading error there, right? So with that being said, I never recommend trying to fix the shading perfectly, especially if you're creating a static hard surface asset. Instead, I just recommend trying to isolate the shading error. And like I said, there are games that literally do this. Next time you go into a video game environment, look in the game. You're going to see assets that have very visible shading errors, but they don't care. Whoever made them probably doesn't care because they're focused on the design, not some really tiny shading problem that nobody's going to notice, all right? So that kind of answers that question about the shading, hopefully. So like back to the example I just showed you here with the boolean, right? Like adding a weighted normal is not going to magically solve your problems, right? Because the issue is nothing to do with a modifier. If I go in here and I add a weighted normal modifier, it's not going to do anything. It's just, it's not the problem, right? The problem is the bent polygon causing that shading error. So I think you kind of understand the point now. Now this next part is very, very important, so pay attention here. This guy asks, what I really want to understand is the complete AAA workflow from start to finish for weapon creation. And if possible, I'd love to hear answers breaking down things like high poly to low poly, topology and cleanup, shading and normals, and exporting to game engines. I'm going to show you everything to answer that question here right now using an actual example we've made before. So this is a game asset from our hard surface game asset 2.0 course. If you don't own that, you can grab it with the Hard Surface Academy, which is linked in the top of the description. More information over there. But what I want to do here is break down how this game asset is built fundamentally, okay? Let me first of all get rid of this. These extras are kind of annoying. So what I have right here, I'll show you two things. We have a high poly version of the weapon, and we have a low poly version here of the weapon. The low poly version is the one that gets used in the actual game engine. Now I know poly count is going to matter less and less, but there's additional reasons to use low poly. I won't get into all that here in this video. It would just be too long. But fundamentally what I have here is I have a high poly weapon that I modeled, and then I have a low poly version that I decimated, okay? So remember this acronym right here, MAD-T. This stands for modeling, automation, decimation, triangulation. First you model, and then you automate, which is basically our version of UV unwrapping in reverse. And then you decimate, which is how you make the low poly version. And then you triangulate, which is how you're able to use n-gons in a game engine. So for example, every single one of these pieces here has a triangulate modifier, and I'll kind of run you through how this works. But this asset right here is full of n-gons, yet it still works in a game environment. I'll put a short clip on the screen right now just to prove it to you. You do not need quote-unquote clean quad topology. It does not matter. What you need to do is optimize the mesh properly and remove or mitigate the shading errors. That is all you need to do, and that gives you full control to focus on the actual model itself in the design. So this guy's first question was, how do professionals decide where to keep detail versus bake it? Okay, so if we go into the high poly, you're going to see we have some details here that are not existent on the low poly, right? Basically, small, tiny details like this that aren't that large and that don't cut through the mesh, you can bake those, okay? Like for example, this big hole right here on the stock, you can't bake that. It's very large, it cuts through the mesh, it won't bake properly. However, small detail kind of like this, you can just delete and get rid of on the low poly version, and you can bake that. So for example, over here as well, we have a small hole. You're going to see in the high poly version, we have more detail than we have here on the low poly, all right? Let's do another example. Let's go to this piece. We have two separate pieces here, kind of with a line, right? Some booleans, a little notch right there. On the low poly version, we don't have that, right? You kind of get the idea. The smaller, less important details that can be baked, especially on like a flat surface, like right here, or the text here, we don't include those on the low poly because they can just be baked, right? So you can either bake it, or you can use, for example, a decal. Now another thing, notice down here, what do we have? We have some very minor shading artifacts. You can kind of see those here in the actual mesh. I'll turn the triangulation on. But again, they're so small, they're basically invisible, that me spending my time and energy trying to make this shading perfect, it's a waste of time. Don't do that. Get the big shading errors removed and just leave the small ones. It doesn't matter. So basically, to answer the question about how do people decide where to keep detail versus bake it, it's very intuitive. You just kind of see what are the small details that I can remove from the high poly and I can just keep on the low poly. Like right here, for example, I didn't remove these because these are pretty large and important elements and I don't want to dilute the quality too much. But if it's like a small detail, like over here, I can just bake it and it's not really going to dilute the quality too much. Now the next question here is, do they rely on bevel modifiers or manual control loops? I guess what he means is like with a sub-D workflow, you would have proximity loops to kind of add the bevel. But in like a Boolean bevel workflow, let me show you how this works here. So on this particular game asset, every single piece has a one segment bevel. This is called a mid-poly workflow, and basically all that means is we use a single segment bevel, which not only looks nice because of the edge highlight, but also avoids a lot of issues with baking and unwrapping and things like that. So to answer his question, we use bevel modifiers for that nice edge highlight set to a one segment count on the low poly version. On the high poly, it's different. We have a 3 segment, doesn't really matter. But on the actual low poly, we use a 1 segment bevel. All right, the next question here is, when do triangles start being introduced, during modeling or only at final optimization? Now, we do this at final optimization. This is the final step of MAD-T. The T is for triangulation. The reason you want to use triangles, you want to triangulate your model, especially when you're using Booleans, is because you're going to have n-gons here. You can see there's n-gons all on this mesh. If I were to export this to a game engine or to a texturing software, the actual software is going to try to triangulate it automatically with its own algorithm. And the reason this isn't good is because it doesn't have a good it might cause overlaps and things like that. So you want to triangulate beforehand in Blender using the Triangulate modifier. So whenever I export this to a game engine or a texturing software, even though we had n-gons, the triangulation turns everything into triangles, and this will work inside the game engine even though we're not using quads here. So to answer the question, when do triangles start being introduced, you do this at the final step of your workflow on the low poly. Once you've modeled everything, once you've unwrapped, once you've decimated, you just add a Triangulate modifier to the entire mesh, and you can see every single piece here. This entire mesh is triangulated, and you can see that very clearly. So yeah, that's how that works. The next question here is, how do they handle Boolean heavy meshes without shading artifacts? Again, you don't want to go without shading artifacts. That would require perfect topology. It's just a pain in the ass. Don't go for perfect shading, go for good enough shading. Like I already showed you in this video, there are games like Star Citizen that still have shading artifacts on their models. It's small, it's irrelevant, they're not obvious, leave it alone and just move on with the workflow. Like, it's a limiting belief is what it is. Since you're the one modeling it, it bothers you. But to everybody else, they don't see it, they don't care about it, and they just don't care. Like these small shading issues down here, nobody cares about. Nobody's gonna notice. In fact, it brings a bit of style to the model. So don't stress about that. All right, and then the next thing about shading and normals is, how do AAA artists keep clean shading across complex geometry? Obviously, with more complex geometry like we have here on the high poly, we just bake the detail onto the low poly. You can use decals, you can bake the detail. If it's like a very complex, set of booleans on a curved surface, again, mitigate the shading as best as you can and just move on with the project. So in more detailed areas, I would just bake that, or I would use a decal. And then he said, what's the correct order for modifiers like weighted normals, bevel? So basically, I'll kind of show you here on the low poly, right? So basically bevel comes first, and then, because the bevel is just for the nice edge highlight here, after the bevel, you're gonna have a weighted normal. You can see that comes after. That's gonna clean up the shading on the flat surface. And then you're gonna have the Triangulate modifier comes last, right? The reason for this is if Triangulate came first, it's not gonna be triangulated on the bevel, right? Because first it's triangulating before the bevel is even added, right? So again, it's gonna be bevel, weighted normal, triangulate. You don't need any other modifiers in the final result. That is the order that it should be in. And then for exporting to game engines, any specific practices for exporting to Unreal or Unity. So it's just triangulation. All you need to do is make sure the mesh is optimized and triangulated. If I export this, I'll put a clip on the screen. This mesh itself will work in a texturing software, it'll work in a game engine, and there will be zero issues. However, if I deformed this asset, I'll even show you here in Blender, this mesh isn't meant to be deformed because it doesn't have quads on it, right? If I try to deform this by going to deform, it's going to look terrible because again, this isn't optimized for deformation. That is why the workflow is contextual, and I don't believe in the term industry standard. It depends what you're trying to accomplish. With this one, I won't deform it because it's just going to look terrible, right? But if I were to deform this for whatever reason, then I would need clean topology. So just to kind of wrap this up, he said, I've tried everything I can find, adjusting normals, testing different remesh workflows, cleaning topology manually, but I still end up with small shading glitches that ruin the presentation. They don't ruin the presentation. Like in this model right here, I already showed you. I have very small shading distortions in certain areas on this mesh, but I don't care about it. Nobody's gonna notice, and the mesh is already optimized to be used in a game engine. Don't stress the small stuff. If you have large shading problems, you might need to go fix that, fair enough. But don't stress that too much. Now he also said, I just want to know what real studio weapon artists actually do step by step. And again, that depends on your goal. Are you going to deform it? Is it a static asset? What are you doing with it? So if anyone can share their process or even a breakdown from your own professional experience, I'd appreciate it more than you can imagine. So hopefully this breakdown right here kind of answered some of those questions more in depth. And again, just to run you through this whole thing, we have our low poly version of the model here, and then the high poly is going to have a lot more detail, which we bake at a later time, usually in Marmoset Toolbag or even in Substance Painter. So you have a high poly version, you have a low poly version, you model, you unwrap, you decimate, and then you triangulate. That is the MAD T workflow. So guys, if you want to learn more about game asset workflows or our modeling workflow, and you want help from us with this stuff personally, check out our Academy program in the link in the top of the description. It explains everything about that offer, what's included, and it also has a bunch of training programs in there specifically for Blender. So go ahead, click the link in the top of the description to learn more about our Hard Surface Academy program. Hope this video was useful, and I'll see you in the next one.